listening to the KGRA Digital Broadcasting Station, Salt Lake City, Utah, Van Buren, Arkansas.
Hi, honey, I'm home.
You're late, mister.
I know. I totally lost track of time watching UFO TV at Bob's. Bob went to Amazon Prime, typed in one word, 5 letters, UFO TV, and then bam, this huge selection of movies popped up. UFOs, Forbidden Archaeology, Suppressed Science, Nikola Tesla, David Icke, and they add new films every week.
I guess that means we're getting UFO TV.
UFO TV is now streaming on Amazon Prime. Look for new films every week. Limited releases also on iTunes. Now streaming free on Amazon Prime from UFO TV, the movie Packing for Mars.
The space program, as most people understand it, is completely a front.
There's a whole nother reality going on out there.
There really is another caste to the human race.
People go through their lives on autopilot all the time. But what people don't realize is that they need the truth.
See the movie Packing for Mars, now streaming on Amazon Prime from UFO TV.
Hi, this is Matt Ray for My Pillow. Look, I'd forgotten what a good night's sleep was like. Then I got a hold of My Pillow. I used to wake up with neck and shoulder pain. I thought it was the new normal. But after one night of using My Pillow, my neck and shoulder pain is gone, and I'm sleeping comfortably through the night. My Pillow's patented interlocking fill conforms to your personal sleep needs. It's guaranteed not to go flat. It's washable, it's dryable, and it's made in the USA, not to mention the 10-year warranty. Try it risk-free with a 60-day money-back guarantee. What have you got to lose besides back pain and shoulder pain? Right now, America's First News has a great deal. Try it for yourself. Call now. You'll get 50% off a 4-pack. That's 2 premium pillows and 2 travel pillows. Call now, 800-716-4835. Use the promo code RAY, R-A-Y. That's 800-716-4835. Use the promo code RAY.
For the thousands of wounded warriors returning from battle, Wounded Warrior Project has developed the Warriors to Work program, a career counseling service that helps wounded warriors translate their military experience to a civilian job. These extraordinary men and women bring more than just teamwork and inspiration to the workplace. They bring proven world-class job skills. And to ensure proper placement, Wounded Warrior Project works with employers to find just the right job fit. Talented, skilled, and eager to get back to work, you have the opportunity to hire a seasoned veteran. Contact Wounded Warrior Project at findwwp.org. Welcome home the brave.
Now streaming on Amazon Prime, UFO TV presents I Know What I Saw, expanded director's cut. Steven Spielberg says compelling. Larry King says this is the real Close Encounters. Apollo 14 astronaut Edgar Mitchell said, I Know What I Saw is the most compelling film on the subject of UFOs to date. I Know What I Saw, expanded director's cut. Now streaming on Amazon Prime. Also available on iTunes and DVD from UFO TV. Now streaming free on Amazon Prime from UFO TV. The knowledge of the forever time. The knowledge of the 8. This is the final episode in this epic journey, now considered the most controversial ancient alien film series in the world today. Discover the knowledge of the forever time. The knowledge of the 8. The final episode, now streaming on Amazon Prime from UFO TV. If God is with you, be sure to bring him. We will all need him.
We are the contact for alternative research topics. The Planet, KGRAradio.com.
Welcome back to Phenomenon Radio Live. Folks, thank you for staying with us. An amazing interview going on right now. I hope you caught all of that in the very first hour of the show, and much more to go. But before we can get back to it, we've got to get to the news, and it's brought to us exclusively by earthfiles.com, okay? So let's get to the news. Linda is here. Linda?
February 2018, this year, solar activity was as low as 2007 levels. And that was the year before the last solar minimum began. And that's why solar physicists now project that the solar cycle 24 minimum leading up to solar cycle 25 will begin a year from now in the spring of 2019. Some solar physicists have even placed bets about whether low energy solar cycle 24 will keep going into solar cycles 25 and 26 and then end up in a Maunder minimum. That was the mostly spotless sun between the years 1645 to 1715 that coincided with a little ice age. Now, why would lack of sunspots cause Earth to get colder? Sunspots result from magnetic activity inside the sun. And paradoxically, as spots on the sun get darker and cooler, the areas around sunspots brighten up. So the more sunspots, the more solar energy reaches Earth. But why would we have a Maunder minimum now in the 21st century? A couple of years ago, in the summer of 2015, the Royal Astronomical Society had Professor Valentina Zarkova speak about her computer solar cycle model. She is analyzing magnetic wave components in our sun, and she discovered the waves appear in pairs at two different layers in the sun's interior. And she told the Royal Astronomical Society, quote, "They both have a frequency of approximately 11 years, although this frequency is slightly different and they are offset in time. Over this cycle, the waves fluctuate between the northern and southern hemispheres of the sun. When you combine both waves together and compare to real data that we already know, for the current solar cycle, we found that our predictions showed an accuracy of 97%. Well, what she and others are projecting from this data going into solar cycle 25, which is supposed to peak in 2022, the two waves will become exactly out of sync, countering each other, and that is expected to significantly reduce sunspots and solar activity. That's when the projection for solar cycle 26 is, quote, "The two waves will exactly mirror each other, peaking at exactly the same time, but in opposite hemispheres of the sun. Their interaction will be disruptive, or they will nearly cancel each other out. We predict that this will lead to the properties of a Maunder minimum. When there is full phase separation, we have the conditions last seen only during the Maunder minimum some 370 years ago," close quote. Well, in 2017, this past year, the sun was completely blank, not a sunspot, for 25% of the year, as that solar cycle 24 was historically weak with probably the lowest number of sunspots for 112 years, going all the way back to 1906. Nothing like this before. Current 2018 computer models project that from the upcoming solar cycle 24 minimum out to solar cycle 26, that is expected to start around 2030, the sun's solar output could be even weaker, taking the sun down to a level like a Maunder minimum. Now, last month, on February 22nd, 2018, the Space Weather Journal published an update on the worsening particle radiation environment now observed and implications for future human deep space exploration. The lead author is Nathan Schwadron, PhD, a physicist at the University of New Hampshire Space Science Center. He also does work for the Solar System Exploration Research Virtual Institute at NASA Ames Research Center in Moffett Field, California. He warns in his new research that cosmic rays in the Earth-Moon system have been peaking at levels never seen before in the modern space age. The increasing cosmic rays can hurt astronauts. Professor Schwadron writes, quote, Over the last decade, the solar wind has exhibited low densities and magnetic field strengths representing anomalous states that have never been observed during the space age. As a result of this remarkably weak solar activity, we are observing the highest fluxes of cosmic rays, close quote. Professor Schwadron is concerned that as solar activity and magnetic fields get weaker and continue to weaken into the 2030s, there will be more and more cosmic rays reaching Earth. They are generated by supernova explosions of stars that burst out into the universe, traveling near the speed of light. Physicists say cosmic rays are the single most energetic particles in the cosmos. Their high energy allows these particles to penetrate nearly every material known to humankind, including astronaut suits and spacecraft shielding. And when cosmic rays penetrate shielding, secondary particles are produced that can damage organs and lead to cancer. NASA has limits about how much cosmic radiation is safe for astronauts, but with the declining sunspots as we move towards solar cycle minimum 24 starting in a year, if solar activity continues to decrease, Professor Schwadron and his colleagues report that a leading computer model of solar activity to predict how bad cosmic rays would become during this next solar cycle 24, they now suggest, quote, a 20% increase of dose rates of cosmic rays from one solar minimum to the next, and that in fact we now see that actual dose rates observed in the last 4 years exceed our predictions by 10%, showing that the radiation environment is worsening even more rapidly than we expected, close quote. This is going to be a big deal for all trips to the moon and Mars in this next decade, and some studies link cosmic rays to cardiac arrhythmias in the general population. Bottom line, if our sun is headed for a lot more blank days without sunspots, for certain cosmic rays will intensify even more in the years ahead as it evolves toward what could be the deepest solar minimum in more than a century. This is Linda Moulton Howe. Please stay tuned to Earth Files news updates on KGRA Radio and visit every day my science, environment, and Real X-Files news website, earthfiles.com, for more on breaking stories about our universe, this solar system, and the planet we live on.
And that's the news. It's always brought to you right here on Phenomenon Radio by earthfiles.com. And I'm going to open up this next hour for a continuous hour. So we're not going to stop, folks. Right. We're going to continue right on. So let's rejoin the show with Daniel and Linda and John.
And Daniel, where you left off before the break is Richard Nixon is down low underneath the White House. He has Robert Merritt. This is the third meeting. Richard Nixon has been crying. Merritt didn't know what to do. And Richard Nixon does something that is almost hard to contemplate with how he approaches Merritt of getting all of this material to Henry Kissinger.
Yes, and it's fascinating because the scene, as you set it up, is when Merritt was telling me about it, you can feel it. It's almost an eerie scene when he gets there, because usually when he comes in, Nixon greets him and takes him by the shoulders and talks about him and talks about assignments and gives him compliments and, calls him James Bond and all the rest of it. This time he didn't do any of that. He sat there for a long time, and Merritt felt, well, if I get up and try to console him, there might be a camera that will blow my brains out. I mean, he was literally that nervous. And this is the kind of environment, Nixon knowing that the Watergate was going to take him down and realizing that he needed Merritt to do this. And he also told him, we're going to meet this time. This is probably the last time we're going to meet. So as he reads him the letter, he tells him, don't ask me any questions about it because I'll consider it almost rude because it's so important. And I've penned this letter myself. Now, the letter, which is the time capsule that we're looking for, and I'll get into the National Archives aspect of it and the letter that's been sent by the Watergate lawyer Douglas Caddy to the National Archives as we go along here. But the letter is in Nixon's own hand, and I think this is significant also. If it were a typed letter, even on presidential White House stationery and just signed by Nixon, people would say, like they do the MJ-12 documents, well, that's signatures just put on there, and this is a copy that's been run off, and this is just something that, these disinformation agents have done, et cetera, et cetera. Nixon put it in his own hand because he wanted to claim that. He wanted this UFO disclosure. He knew about the UFO file. He was somebody who had managed it for years. He knew how significant it was. And this time capsule was going to be his voice after the Watergate took him down. So the other major player who is still alive in this is Henry Kissinger. And there's no question Kissinger is so deep in the secrecy wall that you could say this isn't somebody you'd expect to come forward with any of these details. However, we know that he does have a copy of the letter, according to Merritt. Now, one of the key things we have to remember about Merritt is he did jobs for the Houston plan. And, even though they're working with the president at this incredibly high level, just like the plumbers unit, they do pretty kind of harsh jobs like breaking into offices, taping people, and all the rest of it. They want them for these kind of low-level tasks. And one of the great tasks that Merritt was fantastic for was as a courier, because with the CIA and the FBI and everyone watching Nixon, if he has his secretary do something, if he has a trusted aide like Haldeman do something, the CIA is all over that. But again, with Merritt, no fingerprints. He's a Houston plan operative. He's an invisible man, and he can do this. So after he reads him the letter, he asks him to raise his shirt, and he tapes a package to Merritt's stomach, and the kind of tape that Merritt talks about, he says, is a kind of medical tape that won't hurt when you take it off. And he said, I'm going to place this package with you, and you're going to take it to Henry. The package had a private letter to Henry Kissinger, which, by the way, Merritt didn't read. It had the message to the American people time capsule letter, a copy of it, and it had 2 cassette tapes. Now, there's a lot of speculation about the cassette tapes, and the only thing I can tell you is that we don't know. He knows that they were cassette tapes. That's it. But what I could imagine those cassette tapes contain is a kind of worldwide broadcast narrative that Nixon left there with Kissinger. Now, he tapes the package to his stomach, and he grabs him with both hands. He grabs his wrist, and he says, can you do this for me? Can you take it to Kissinger? And he said, you're going to have to be careful. You're going to be watched. And Merritt guarantees him that he's going to do it. It turns out that he also says, if you go there and you don't find Kissinger, you're to mail it, because the package looked ordinary enough. And he said, just mail it like a normal package. It even had postage on it. It was all set. Drop it into the post. So Nixon's planning here, and the message eventually does get to Kissinger because, according to Merritt, Nancy Kissinger, who became Kissinger's wife, calls him and tells him, Henry wanted you to know, we got the letter. We got your package. That's significant, I think, because it shows that Nixon's method worked. He was able to get that package through. And what is also significant is the incredible level of friendship that he has there with Henry Kissinger, but he's trusting Merritt as his sort of main courier. He's the man who he can trust to get this job done.
And what an insight into Richard M. Nixon, that he would think about taking surgery tape and asking Merritt to pull up his shirt so he could take this envelope that has the 2 audio cassettes and the 2 letters, and that Nixon would personally take the surgery tape and tape it to this man's stomach with the idea to get it to Henry Kissinger. It is almost like a metaphor for the control and the always thinking ahead to manipulate everybody around him in the most intimate way, Richard Nixon.
There's no question. He's getting around the Angletons and the Richard Helms of the world, and Richard Helms was the CIA director at the time. And of course, we know that he had a number of clashes with Richard Helms. One of them that I think is particularly significant and relates to what we're talking about is what Haldeman recorded, which is that he kept sending Haldeman into Helms' office to say, just forget about this Watergate thing. Can you leave the investigation where it is? And Helms not budging. And then finally, Nixon says, tell him that the president says it's going to open up the whole Bay of Pigs thing, so not to go there. And so he says, all right, I'll try it. And he goes there, and Haldeman goes back into Helms' office, and Helms, who's usually cool as a cucumber, never raises an eyebrow at anything. As soon as Haldeman says it's going to get into that whole Bay of Pigs thing, Helms explodes. He turns red. He yells at the top of his lungs, this has nothing to do with that. You tell the president he has no right to say that. This is an outrage. I won't take this. So years later, Haldeman writes in the autobiography, I realized that the Bay of Pigs thing was shorthand for the JFK assassination. Nixon's right there. He's playing the ultimate card. He's saying, if you support the Watergate investigation, it's going to lead to the CIA's role in the JFK assassination. So we see that Nixon was able to play this role. And there's no question when he's getting the information to Henry Kissinger, that's his fail-safe. Because the time capsule he's placed in the White House, but he's got Kissinger there who has the backup of the letter. And then Merritt somehow is this human time capsule. Merritt remembered the whole thing. When he told me the story, it was exactly as it occurred. I'm thinking, with Merritt's memory, Nixon had sized him up and said, this is someone who will bring the story forward at the right time.
And yet, Robert Merritt is transitioning out of life right now. And the intriguing question is, Daniel, do you think Henry Kissinger kept that letter, that package, or would he have trashed it to keep his life clean? Because there was so much tension between Kissinger and Nixon, and that Kissinger really, I think, was looking at the president at that time as pathetic.
Mm-hmm. Well, he definitely was looking at him as baggage, for sure. But Nixon did secure the deal when he got the pardon that Henry would remain as Secretary of State, and I think that that's significant.
Well, do you think that Henry Kissinger still has the package or not?
I would say that the odds of recovering the message to the American people time capsule is better than getting it from Henry Kissinger. But I have no doubt that Kissinger has seen it.
Yeah, it's really odd, isn't it? The political triangulation between Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, and that we have seen through Newsweek that in those terrible days when Nixon knew that he was going to have to resign, and Kissinger himself told Evan Thomas, that he was called, I believe, he was called to the White House by Nixon, also late at night, and that he asked Kissinger to get down on his knees with him to pray.
Absolutely. And here's where we're going to go into the kind of mystical side of Nixon, too, because Nixon was raised as a Quaker. And the Quakers have all kinds of interesting, even though his dad was a Baptist, his mom was a Quaker. So there's a lot of things to Quaker meeting, for example. They wait for the Spirit to move them to speak. There's a kind of like a subtle magic, in a sense, a kind of folk magic that goes along with being a Quaker. And certainly they also look for divine guidance. So that scene where he's praying in the White House with Kissinger, I've always found very fascinating. But I'll tell you something else that I've found in my deep researches around Nixon, which is that Nixon was very superstitious. He had a thing for threes. Even his 3 meetings with Merritt are fascinating. And the fact that he gives him the instructions on the time capsule 3 times is also very interesting and suggests a kind of a numerology thing. And you start to think to yourself, Nixon knew about the UFO file. I don't think there's any doubt about that, relating to the, Cooper whistleblower and these other things that we've heard about. But also, let's go a little deeper into Nixon's mind, because as I was finding things out about Nixon, I found out that Jeane Dixon had called or visited the White House 87 times during Nixon's presidency. Now, Jeane Dixon was a very famous psychic and astrologer during this period of the 60s and 70s. But if you go into her background, she'd actually been advising presidents since FDR. And as a matter of fact, her visit to the White House for FDR was in 1944. Now, I find it interesting. With Nixon, she had a much closer relationship, however, and he must have heard about her through all this. But there are tapes with Nixon talking about getting advice about the Mideast crisis and things that would happen from Dixon. So there's no question about it. Now, when we go into what Jeane Dixon thought relating to UFOs, it's also quite fascinating, because she felt UFO disclosure was something that was absolutely necessary for the planet in the 70s. And as we look at the 70s culture, we're looking at things like the Close Encounters movie, which Spielberg brought forward, all of these documentaries around it, including Ebenegger's. The entire culture seems set up and wired. There are Star Wars, Battlestar Galactica, an incredible alien-human interaction that when you look at it all, you think, somebody's master hand is sort of putting this all together. But it gets cut off somewhere. And it's, the Carter administration opens up the FOIA documents. We're getting much more of a big UFO picture. And by 1980, there's your documentary, of course. Mm-hmm. That is kind of like, the society is changing and these really challenging things are coming out. So we can see that Nixon, in working with somebody like Jeane Dixon, who had this real wide, vast sense of what the UFO interaction with the UFO file was all about and what that interrelation on kind of a spiritual, psychospiritual level would be. And she's visiting the White House or talking to Nixon 87 times. It's remarkable. And she kept up with these White House contacts even through the Reagan administration. So she certainly was well known as this someone who could give them advice on that side of things. And of course, people think, well, presidents, they don't use astrology or they don't use psychic information. Well, they do. And they certainly make decisions based on it. But I find it fascinating when we look at Nixon, we start to understand things about him. When he is going over the letter and he's talking about the formula and how it will cement his place in history long after Watergate, it's important for us to understand his sense of fate, because he always thought he was meant to be there as that person who would make world peace. And as many of the things, he's a very dark light, Jekyll and Hyde kind of situation. But of course, he created the SALT I and the SALT II treaties, with the first nuclear reduction treaties that were ever negotiated by the United States with the Soviet Union. So this sense of fate, this sense of history, when he's being faced with Watergate and all of his great achievements are going to go down this political rabbit hole and he's going to end up looking like a crook, then he's thinking to himself, how do I regain that? How do I become this kind of comeback president? And I think the time capsule and Robert Merritt were his failsafe, because if something were to happen during that period of time that showed the UFO disclosure and the time capsule came forward, then Nixon would be redeemed in a sense, because he was somebody who worked closely on that UFO file, and he had brought this energy formula to the United States to make us the greatest nation in the world. This is where I think he was going with placing the time capsule. But somehow he had the strange confidence when he's talking to Merritt that it will absolutely be discovered.
Which is so odd, because we're talking on March 8th, live radio 2018, and Robert Merritt's doctors say that he has terminal cancer, and that you, I, and others are really not convinced that Henry Kissinger would allow himself to go down in history as the one who opens up the package from Nixon half a century later about the advanced being, leaving this question: what gave Nixon the confidence that one way or the other his letter to the American people would be discovered and read? And right now, as we speak, isn't it true that the archivist at the National Archive is now a brand new dot, that they have the letter through Douglas Caddy from Robert Merritt that is explaining exactly where this handwritten letter of Nixon is, and that we're all waiting for the National Archive to reply?
It is. And I think this was an interesting choice to do it, to go to the archivist, because there's a lot of information that's come out over the last 5 years on Merritt that has gone into the National Archives through a lot of FOIA requests, etc. So all of these historians who work around these issues like Watergate, they come up with Merritt. They make these requests and stuff. So a number of files were added to the archive. So Merritt is not an unknown to this archivist. Now, Caddy's letter states it very simply. And of course, you're mentioned in the letter, as I am, as excuse me, people who would be there when the time capsule was opened. And I certainly hope to be there with you when it is.
Me too.
No question. What a great day that would be. But one of the things that I noticed about the letter is it's a very simple exchange, which is Merritt and Caddy have suggested that the National Archives should take possession of the letter. They don't want the letter. They're not trying to cause a media sensation with it. What they're trying to do is get it read before the media and get it distributed to the public. That's the deal that is in the letter, and Merritt will provide the directions to how to get to the time capsule if the archivist will agree to those terms. And that's where it stands now. We do know that they received the letter. They have not responded, but it was sent in mid-February, so it's a few weeks out, and I'm sure they have a workload that's pretty huge, but somewhere back there, they're looking at this letter and thinking, they're thinking it over for sure as to what they want to do about it. But I do think it's fascinating. It's a piece of history. It should be disclosed because, as Nixon's last testament, it's a fascinating piece of history by itself. When you add in the UFO disclosure aspect and the energy independence aspect, I'm not sure if they will release that part of the message. And I think this is where the rub is, that if they do go along with the idea of opening the capsule and opening the message, that when they get to the part about the formula, there might be some national security questions. And as I understand it, initially, the letter will fall under the domain of the State Department, because that's where the president, that's the umbrella that he's under. So they would be the agency to decide whether or not to move forward on it and release it to the public. My guess is that there's no question that there would be some moves to censor the letter going out to the public, depending on what's inside of it. If what is in there is what Merritt claims, and Merritt has an excellent memory of the meeting and Nixon reading the letter to him, my guess is there might be something where they say, yes, the letter is here, but we can't release the whole thing.
Well, this may be, I don't mean to put you on the spot. I wanted to know, do you think, has anybody recorded Merritt, Robert Merritt, with his tape recorder mind, reading back, as it were, from his mind's eye or his ears, the entire letter as he remembers Richard Nixon telling him?
Well, it's fascinating because I've gone through the letter with him, and I recently did a follow-up interview, which he said was his final interview, that I am going to be releasing next week, where he fills out more details and clarifies some things relating to the letter. But I feel that the information that we have relating to it and what it says is, in general, that Nixon is saying, we got in touch with this being and it fell into our laps, basically. I'm thinking that's kind of a crash retrieval situation, and that they worked with the being. Now, if we go back briefly here to your Earth Files series with the whistleblower Cooper, who eventually was the man that came forward that we got to see at the Citizens Hearing for Public Disclosure, and there's a brief film of him. What he says that I think is so significant when we look at this is that he's meeting there with Nixon, that it's Nixon who has to be the liaison going to Area 51, and that they have a being there, and that, in fact, Cooper didn't expect to see it when he went there, when they agreed, okay, they backed off from Eisenhower's threat and said, sure, you can bring your guys in. And he goes there and they show it to him. He expected to get briefed, but as I understand it, when I listen back to it, he didn't expect to actually see this being.
In fact, Cooper Stein was afraid because of his fundamentalist Christian upbringing that this was a demon. And he said to his boss, Anthony Barden from the CIA, I don't want to be in the same room with a demon. So his boss said, then we have rooms with one-way mirrors. And that where apparently this was put together by our government when they constructed these facilities so that they could have live alien beings that they could watch, monitor, and videotape through one-way mirrors. I don't know how, but that's the impression I've gotten. And that he was in the room behind a mirror, and that he could see, and that he watched his boss talk with the being, and they talked later about how it was telepathic, and so that when he said, I watched my boss, that they were staring eye to eye, but there was no audible sound because everything was telepathic, which raised more questions. How was this military authority able to have an interview with the Anthony Barden and the boss, and that it was all handled telepathically because the being could not talk the way we would talk? And that this was to me, this was both a comment on the 1950s society, culture, religion, fundamentalism that in many ways that Cooper Stein represented, even though he worked for the CIA. That's who paid him his checks. And that he was afraid. Now, clearly, the superior military officer in the CIA, I think there were two people with the being in the office. And he said that the being went along with them and put on a T-shirt so it would look more human. It did put on a T-shirt, was wearing a T-shirt. And all of this, when you put it together, brings me back to think about what you and I had discussed when we were doing the interview, that Jimmy Carter, who had one or two dramatic UFO sightings, and had promised during his campaign that he would open up everything there was on UFOs. And then the story that we have is that he was shown a somewhat thick file, and that firsthand people have said that Jimmy Carter began to cry and then to sob, and they left him in the room alone, I guess, for an hour. That's what I've heard. And that the crying and the sobbing related to a completely a complete unrecognizable definition of our Earth history that would have included religious history, and that it made Jimmy Carter cry. Now, there is also what you told me is that Jimmy Carter asked his director of the CIA, who was George Bush, senior, there's been three Bushes, but the senior, that Jimmy Carter, wanted to see the UFO file, thinking he wanted to see everything.
Right.
What was Bush's reaction which is such an insight, again, into this war in the Pentagon.
Well, Bush is such a deep state player. And I think that there are, factors in that interaction. For Carter to fire Bush as CIA director is a very dramatic action.
Well,
and
explain. Carter asked. Yeah.
Carter asked him for the UFO file, and Bush's response was, you don't have a need to know. That's above your need to know, and it's not the kind of thing that I'm going to give to you. And Carter fires him the same day. So Carter installs Stansfield Turner, who is his friend. And Stansfield Turner is such an outsider at the CIA. He's in a situation that's very much like John McCone when they put him in as CIA director under Kennedy. He's such an outsider. He doesn't have access to anything. He's not a Dulles insider. He's not an Angleton insider. So Stansfield Turner spends the majority of his time as the CIA director basically trying to get on the inside. But Carter has tremendous difficulties. One of the amazing things that he does once they boot Bush is he opens up the FOIA requests and he lowers the fees on them, which I think is interesting. He's opening up the society. I believe when you look at it, we're looking at Nixon making the drive to be the disclosure president, and then Watergate ruins that opportunity. The next real opportunity is Carter. And again, we're facing an energy crisis. I think Carter was thinking in these terms, and there were definitely forces inside there working with him on that because we see the culture preparing for it. But again, the block comes down, and actually UFO research turns into SDI Star Wars out there ready to fight a threat in the Reagan administration. So they're giving Reagan information about the threat that is happening out there. And of course, Gorbachev confirmed at a press release in 2014. Now, this had always been rumored, but Gorbachev had never said anything about it. Neither had Reagan. But he's sitting there in this conversation talking to Charlie Rose, and he's there with George Shultz. And interestingly enough, Kissinger is in the audience. And he says, Reagan, during Reykjavik, took me aside and said, I want to speak without our advisors. Let's go for a walk. And then he turned to him very intently at a certain point to say, if there's an alien invasion, will you help us? And Gorbachev was very disturbed by the question, but he said, of course. And he was trying to figure it out, but he knew that Reagan was dead serious. And Reagan took him by the arm and said, we'll help you too. Now, there are reports that Reagan was getting all of these different images coming back from when they were developing this idea of putting SDI out there, and that they were getting incredible fleets of craft and things that they were getting photos of and using the reconnaissance for. And they were showing that to Reagan and saying, this looks like it constitutes a pretty major threat. Oddly enough, the Iran-Contra funding and the Iran-Contra fraud goes off the scale right around the same time, as if somebody in that government is looking for a lot of money to support a program that's going to be a complete black budget program to look into this. But I do feel the fact that we have a piece of history now with Gorbachev saying, Reagan absolutely stopped me, looked me in the eye, and said, will you help us with an alien invasion? We all know about the unusual comments that Reagan made at these United Nations meetings. So there we start to see this presidential string for real with the UFO disclosure factor. And I think it went off the president's radar. And I think that one of these interesting things about Trump, who even today said we're going to do a lot more with space, and has developed the Space Corps, for example, where he wanted the Air Force to report to the Space Corps, not the other way around. There are these attempts now, there are these grabs around the space aspect, because we're not only dealing with a space economy and all of the suborbital level corporations that are doing satellites and all the rest of it, but there's a real major push for things like space tourism, space mining, and all the rest of it. And when we get to that level, those companies out there are definitely, if they're doing space tourism, people are going to be seeing these UFOs, and there's going to have to be some type of explanation for what's going on. So they're moving on these different sides to get some kind of angle on UFO disclosure. Interestingly enough, this story from over 45 years ago of Nixon working on UFO disclosure, then being derailed and hiding it in a time capsule in the White House, really connects us to the modern period, because one thing I was able to discover was a letter from Nixon directly to Trump and which is absolutely fascinating. It's an actual letter from Nixon to Trump saying, if you run for office, me and Pat are convinced that you'll become president. That's in 1987.
Wow. My
Amazing.
gosh.
Yeah.
And there is a real puzzle here, Daniel. If Merritt, in discussing with you, and we talked about this some, is saying that he understood from Nixon that advanced being from this universe or perhaps another universe has been at Los Alamos or maybe Area 51 or Wright-Patterson or moving around, who knows. And you or I somehow there was the question, is the being still alive? And the implication was that for at least 20 years, this being had been or is still helping scientists and our government. Didn't you get that impression?
Absolutely. It's definitely the 2 decades. There's no question about that.
Okay, now here's the big puzzle. If, in fact, and Cooper Stein watched through that one-way mirror a being that was not human, but put a T-shirt on to look a little bit more human, and communicated telepathically only with his superior officers and his CIA boss. And he thought it was a demon, but his other CIA and military colleagues did not. And that we have Robert Merritt hearing the President of the United States talk with glowing, wonderful words about this advanced being that is helping us. And this formula has come from this being, and that it could revolutionize and release energy to the entire planet, if not just the United States, and free us, as Nixon was thinking. Mm-hmm. Then how do you reconcile that with Louis Elizondo, highlighted in the December 16th, 2018 New York Times, above the fold and on the web, with the videotape of the infrared videotape from the gun camera of one of the jet fighters, and then another 2 videos, and that Louis Elizondo was in an office in the 5th floor C ring of the Pentagon from 2007 to 2012 on money that Senator Harry Reid in Nevada was able to muster $23 million that paid a lot to Bigelow Aerospace by the own New York Times article, and set up this office with Louis Elizondo heading it, called Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. And Len Stringfield told me in the early 80s that when he was in the Air Force in the 1950s, early 1950s, right after the war period, this was Len Stringfield looking right at my eyes and saying this, Linda, we had a standing order to shoot down UFOs. And we lost so many pilots trying to do that by the middle of the 1950s, that order was rescinded. Yeah. Now, how do you take this strange contradictory fabric that you get one facet of history and it sounds like we're dealing with beings that are considered to be allies, like the pear-shaped grays. Mm-hmm. But then you hear another person, whether they're working in government or intelligence, and they say, no, we're dealing with intelligences out there that want to annihilate humanity on the earth without explanation. And the remote viewers say we have friendlies and we have unfriendlies, and the whole thing is chop suey. So how could we have an advanced being for at least 20 years giving us that extraordinary red colored formula, because Nixon highlighted it in the letter,
right?
that Robert Merritt remembers didn't even have numbers. It didn't have letters. It was symbols, and he related it to an advanced genius formula.
Mm-hmm. Well,
how do you reconcile these two opposites of war and an advanced being trying to help us?
Well, it's fascinating because we are looking at two totally different points of view on that when you think about the threat program versus Nixon thinking this could be our key to energy independence, and we got it under my administration. And he emphasized that. I find that interesting because this is him taking credit under his administration. They had the breakthrough with Russia. They had the breakthrough with China. There are all these things that he did. He created the EPA, but he's taking that mentality and using it when he's talking about the formula. And he said, under my administration, we got this. So he's taking ownership in a sense of what it is. I do think the crux of the entire story is the formula when you get right down to it, because what he's thinking is he was able to accomplish something just like no other president had, as he was able to make these breakthroughs with Russia and China. But I'll tell you something, when I was listening to Merritt and when he was going through his story of being beneath the White House and meeting with Nixon and Nixon talking about how we had this being, it helped me tremendously to think about the work that you'd done with Cooper. It put it together for me very well. And this is what I find missing in the disclosures of people like Elizondo and the whole Tom DeLonge story, is that they're not working with a real work that's been done. They're not building on the foundation of what's been done. They're trying to come in this back alley way and say, look, over here, it's UFO day one. And by the way, they're a threat. And by the way, you can't say they're aliens. So I find that a completely CIA-dominated approach. And for me, there are no answers there. We're already further down the road with the research that you've done over several decades and with the things that we're finding out through people like Merritt.
Where do you think from March 8th this evening going forward that this will evolve? Meaning, if the National Archives and the archivist have this letter from an attorney, Caddy, on behalf of Robert Merritt, and we have an administration in which if the Secretary of State is the one who can give the green light or red light to the archivist, and that's Tillerson. And Tillerson is on the playing board with President Trump and all of the chaos that he is in. Do you think that there would be any light at the end of the tunnel reason for Trump and Tillerson to say, go ahead, let's get this Nixon letter and let's read it?
Well, it's fascinating because Trump is very unpredictable, and he certainly doesn't shy away from a major challenge, that's for sure. But funny that you mentioned Tillerson, because one of the things when Trump reopened the Space Council that Bush had originally opened in the 90s, he had Pence at the head of it. And this is last summer, but if you look at the photo op around it, sitting next to Pence was Tillerson, who is all about our Secretary of State relations. So the idea, maybe when you look at that picture, is they're planning to have some kind of relations, or at least planning to. And that takes me back to letters by Gordon Cooper to the United Nations, trying to get them to take the issue seriously and saying, I'm the astronaut with the experience. There are people who have seen these things. We do know it's a deep Department of Defense secret. It's something that needs to be brought out. That's 1977 that he's writing that. And if we can connect these dots up from everything we've been talking about, which is the Merritt meetings beneath the White House with President Nixon, the Emmenegger documentary that the Nixon administration funded, the Cooper revelations about Nixon being in control of that CIA corridor between the White House and Area 51. If we take that to Trump and where we are now, Trump seeing something like this, I guarantee you that the faux disclosure movement that they pushed in the New York Times on December 16th was a thoroughly democratic effort. That is, it was started under Podesta with the idea that Hillary was going to be in and would be able to move the subject forward on their terms. I do feel that when presidents get in, they find a way to get their hands, or they attempt to find a way to get their hands on the UFO file. Trump's way in really would be the time capsule, if you think about it. And that, after all, Nixon was a Republican president. But when you get right down to it, the information is not Republican or Democrat. It's just something that would advance our idea of history. It would advance our sense of who we are and what we're doing here in the world. But it also, according to Nixon, would expand our energy independence. And there's a breakthrough energy aspect to this. So I think for all those reasons, it's a compelling case for them to want to open it. Whether the public gets to see it or not is the great question.
And I think that when you boil all of this down, what is the strangest paradox of the last 70 years since World War II is, why did Truman and Churchill and Eisenhower move so quickly to say, we must keep this bottled up for another 50 years? Because they assumed that telling the world the truth that we weren't alone in the universe and that there were alien presences interacting with our planet was somehow going to destroy civilization. And today, in 2018, millennials accept that we're not alone in the universe. I see that all the time. So why, in whose interest is it now to perpetuate the idea that there is something warlike in this?
There's no question. It's a major key, because not only can you create an entire wing of the Defense Department to deal with it, which would lead you to all kinds of financial avenues that aren't available right now, but you also could employ a number of different companies like SpaceX and all the rest of it to help you do that are private companies. You could create these channels of finance, and you wouldn't have to have that as a black budget project anymore. You could put it on budget. So there are manipulations that we have to watch for as these things come to light. There's no question. The truth is, the secrecy wall being in place has created a schizophrenic situation in the public, where the public sees and knows more than the government is telling them. Right. And so there's a kind of a cycle of disrespect going on there, where we know that they're covering up and they know that we know.
And we have to go to a break now, but Daniel, why don't we come back in another month or two on Phenomenon Radio under the subject, the schizophrenic government, the who, the what, the why of the Rube Goldberg machine that is behind the whole huge issue of what is in the UFO file. And
I would love to. That would be great.
Yeah. I thank you for one of the most fascinating 2 hours I've ever experienced. And we'll get this organized for another Phenomena Radio upcoming. And please, as soon as we know what we can do with or not with the archive and the White House, call me, and I would love to be there if they end up reading it in public.
That would be perfect, and you're just the first person I thought of, so for sure. But it's great to be on with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
To find more on Daniel, go to darkjournalist.com. Everything you need to know about Dan is right there. For John Burroughs, for Linda Moulton Howe, for our very special guest, Daniel Liszt, thank you all for joining us. I am Ray Sobbs. Stay tuned for 3 hours of Jimmy Church and Fade to Black. And tonight's Fader Night, everybody. That means open lines, so get those calls in. You're listening to KGRA Radio, your contact for the best in alternative talk radio on the World Wide Web. Have a great night and a great weekend, everybody.